This is Camp Countdown, a Toronto Maple Leafs podcast series. I'm your host, Kyle Cushman, and on today's show, we have a big one in store. It's Dennis Hildeby, the top goaltending prospect in the Maple Leafs organization. Hildeby was drafted 122nd overall by the Maple Leafs in 2022, and he is coming off of his first season in the American Hockey League. He posted a .913 save percentage in 41 games with the Marlies, setting a new rookie record for the franchise with 21 wins in those 41 contests. He was kind of expected to split starts over the course of the season coming into the year, just given Martin Jones was expected to be on the roster, would battle with a more experienced Keith Petruzzelli, at least in North America. But due to injuries and Martin Jones being called up, as well as Petruzzelli's struggles, Hildeby basically became the starting guy for most, if not all of the season after a couple of weeks. And he performed admirably in that role. As I mentioned, 41 games, set a Marlies rookie record in wins, and was the starter in the playoffs and looked good through a couple of games with 35 saves in Game 1 against Belleville, 31 saves in Game 2 in that win against Belleville, and then ultimately dropping that Game 3 in overtime after allowing 4 goals on 24 shots. But for Hildeby, before we look ahead to what's next for him, I think it's important to go back and kind of see how he got to this point. As I mentioned, Hildeby was drafted 122nd in 2022, the 4th round, by the Maple Leafs, and they actually traded into that slot to add an extra 4th round pick to select Hildeby in 2022. And it was an interesting move because Hildeby wasn't some young hotshot goaltender that everybody was raving about in kind of the draft sphere. He was entering his last year of draft eligibility. He was 20 years old when he was drafted and was 21 by the time that his post-draft season started. So why did the Leafs trade into the 4th round to take a nearly 21-year-old goaltender out of Sweden? Well, the size is the first thing. He's 6'7", over 220 pounds. He's a massive guy who fills a lot of the net. But I think it's also important to note kind of what was going on in Hildeby's game at that time. When he was drafted, he was coming off of a bit of a breakout season, I think you could say. He didn't play a ton that season, only 12 games in the junior circuit and 7 games at the SHL level, but he had a .931 save percentage at both levels. It was also his first season after undergoing elective double hip surgery. So all those factors combined, maybe a better bill of health for Hildeby, feeling better in his big frame, growing into his big frame, all those factors, and in a smaller sample, put up very good numbers. And the Leafs clearly believed in that small sample to jump into the 4th round and snag him in that draft before he became a free agent if he didn't go undrafted in 2022, which, if we're being honest, was probably unlikely when you look at a 6'6", 6'7" goaltender with a .931 save percentage and at least a small sample in an elite pro league. Before we even get to the next season, the Leafs signed Hildeby to a contract. And that's important to note because of the recent rule changes in the Swedish to NHL transfer agreement. Before 2022, it was basically you could draft a player out of Europe, and for the most part across all of the leagues, you could sign them to an NHL contract and they could come to the American League right away. That changed in 2022, at least for Sweden, where the transfer agreement became any player under the age of 24 drafted outside of the first round would actually have to spend one more season in Sweden after signing their entry-level contract before coming to the NHL. That doesn't apply to players drafted in the first round, but anyone drafted outside of the first round, in like Hildeby's case, the 4th round, and is under the age of 24, which he was in 2022, signing that contract meant that unless he was in the NHL, he would have to remain in Sweden rather than playing in the American League. So the Leafs signed him at that time so that by 23-24, he could come to the AHL. And that's exactly what happened. In 22-23, he finally played his first full season in professional hockey with Färjestad. Played 21 games, posted a .918 save percentage, very strong numbers for a goaltender at 21 years old, and basically was a split starter that year with Matt Tompkins, a veteran who is now in the Tampa Bay organization, and his numbers were comparable or better than Tompkins over the course of that season. Hildeby comes over to the Marlies at the end of the campaign, gets one start, kind of gets his feet wet, I guess you could say, in the American League before setting up for his first full rookie season this past year. If the Leafs don't sign Hildeby in 22, they wait to see what he does over the course of a full season in Sweden in 22-23. Hildeby is making his pro debut in North America this upcoming fall rather than last fall. So that proactive nature by the Leafs allowed them to get Hildeby to the Marlies last season and really set things up for what is trending to be one of the better goaltending prospects in hockey. He was recently ranked top 20 across the league among goaltenders by Scott Wheeler. And given the size, given the profile, and given kind of the last couple of years and how strong they've been, it's very real to look at Hildeby as one of the top goaltending prospects in hockey. Obviously not in the Yaroslav Askarov, Jesper Wallstedt, Trey Augustine, Jacob Fowler, like that echelon. But in that kind of second, third tier after those guys, he's certainly in the mix as one of the top goaltending prospects in hockey right now, coming off of a very strong rookie season in the AHL. But at the same time, I think it's also important to remember that because he was drafted in his draft plus 3 season, in his 4th year of eligibility, in his last year of draft eligibility, that Hildeby is going to be 23 by the time next season starts. His birthday is August 19th. He's going to celebrate that in like a week and a half's time. We kind of think of him as younger, I think, because he was drafted in 22, because he only made his AHL debut last season, because he only has 2 seasons of pro hockey under his belt. I think most people think of him as like a 21, 22-year-old. He's 22 right now, but he's going into his age 23 season. And when you compare that to somebody like Joseph Woll, who we've seen develop with the Marlies over the past handful of years and become potentially the Maple Leafs starting goaltender for a full season, this is the equivalent of Woll's 21-22 season. That's when he had his age 23 season. Joseph Woll made his NHL debut that season. That was the year that he really took off at the AHL level, made some NHL starts, and by the following season, he was a legitimate option for the Maple Leafs and played in the playoffs for the Leafs. So if you're comparing that timeline, we could definitely expect Hildeby to play NHL games this season in a pinch. Obviously, we hope that both Joseph Woll and Anthony Stolarz are healthy, but you look at the track record for both goaltenders. Woll obviously has some injury woes and experienced that a couple of times last season that ultimately derailed things in the middle of the regular season and then also going into Game 7. And you look at Anthony Stolarz, and he hasn't played a significant workload at the NHL ever, and period, in a few years. So you look at those two goaltenders and you're expecting them to be your starting goaltender or split starts or whatever the situation ends up being. There's a very real possibility that one of those goaltenders isn't available at some point over the course of the season and potentially early in the season. You have Matt Murray signed to a contract as kind of an insurance policy, but obviously we know his struggles over the past few years in terms of staying healthy and even just being on the ice at all last season. So Hildeby is basically the guy as the third stringer, first call up, ready to go if the Leafs need a goaltender. And because of that, I think we see him make his NHL debut this season at some point in 1 or 2 starts, and we kind of see how things go. Obviously, that depends on if Hildeby is able to continue off of his strong rookie season, but I think he will be based off of what we've seen the last couple of seasons. And so the timeline then becomes, well, when does he become a full-time NHL goaltender? And I think you look at the Anthony Stolarz contract, 2 years. You look at the Woll extension, he's going to be here for a handful of years. And it becomes, can Hildeby take over an NHL role by the time Stolarz's contract comes up? And I think that's a likely scenario. Again, when you look at Joseph Woll and his progression, his age 23 season, he made his NHL debut. Age 24 season, started to play a little bit more at the NHL level after a great AHL season and became a guy in the playoffs due to injury. And then in his age 25 season, he became an NHL regular for the first time. And you compare that to what Hildeby would be, age 23 season coming up right now, 24-25. Age 24 season, building on that, getting ready to play a full-time NHL role in 25, 26, and then become an NHL regular in 26, 27 when Anthony Stolarz is out of contract and you're looking to bring somebody up to the NHL level and take over. So all of that goes to say that Hildeby is on the cusp of the NHL. It's likely that we're still waiting a couple more seasons for him to become an NHL regular. And that's perfectly fine to me. He's going to be 23 this season, but he does not have nearly as much professional experience in North America as somebody like Joseph Woll did at that age, or basically most goaltenders in the AHL do at that age. He has one season in Sweden as a split starter. He has one season in the AHL as a primary starter, and that's it at the professional ranks. He needs more time to figure things out, build on his game at the AHL level, get consistent minutes, and that's exactly what the Leafs have set him up to do based off of what things are like at the NHL level in terms of the crease with Joseph Woll and Anthony Stolarz here for at least a couple of seasons, unless one of them gets traded, which at this point in time is very premature to kind of even speculate about. So Hildeby is somebody that I'm definitely excited about. To me, he's clearly the top goaltending prospect in the organization, just given the size profile and how he's played the past 2 years and how we've already seen him with the Marlies. And so now it's about what he can build upon this upcoming season in the AHL. So I'm very excited to see Hildeby's progression in his sophomore season in North America. But all you can say right now is that he's passed every test since being drafted. And that's exactly what you want to see from a 6'7" goaltender. You take in this 4th round trade into that slot to take him and sign him right away. And so Hildeby, very impressive the past couple of seasons. We'll see what he can do this upcoming season. And so I'm very excited to get to my conversation now with Greg Balloch, goaltending scout for Elite Prospects, EP Rinkside, as well as In Goal Magazine, to talk about Hildeby's progression the past couple of years and potentially when we could see him at the NHL level. Very excited to be joined now by Greg Balloch of EP Rinkside, and of course you've seen his work on In Goal Magazine as well, to chat a little bit about top Maple Leafs goaltending prospect Dennis Hildeby. Greg, thanks for taking the time today.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I know I definitely found my niche when I get asked to go on podcasts about the Leafs' 4th string goaltender. So I think I hit a nice spot here. Yeah,
gotta love it. Well, that's the whole point of the series. We're going through everybody in the Leafs organization, and I think a lot of people are excited about Dennis Hildeby right now, just given his massive 6'7" frame, coming off of a rookie season in the AHL. But I also think a lot of those people probably haven't really seen him play at all. Can you describe a little bit about Hildeby's style and what you saw from him last season?
Well, I think, just from the way you described him, I think a lot of people probably have a somewhat of an idea what to expect from a 6'7" goaltender. But yeah, he's a huge frame in the net, takes up a ton of visual space, which you love to see. Plays a relatively conservative style because he doesn't have to be overly aggressive. He's got the size to spare, so he doesn't play with a lot of backwards flow. He stays deep in his net, and he uses his size effectively, which is what you want to see. And that, I told you before I came on, I'm pretty high about his game. I like what I see. There's still a lot to work on. Obviously, there was, that time earlier last year where there was thoughts that maybe he'd come up in the emergency situation, but he's clearly not ready for that yet. He still has a lot to work on down with the Marlies, but I just love the raw, just what he brings to the table. Really is just that size, and then honestly, he reminds me a lot of Freddie Anderson in a way, and I don't know how that will resonate with a lot of Leafs fans hearing that name drop, but just the similarities in their game are so apparent, and doesn't show off a lot of flashy skating, and doesn't really have to, because he's not, like I said, an overly aggressive goaltender, but so good on his posts and his ability to go from post to post. It's so seamless and so easy for him because he's got that size and ability. So, like I said, I really like what I've seen from him so far in his North American professional career, and can't wait to see where he goes next.
Yeah, he made the jump from Sweden to the AHL last season, as I mentioned, playing as a rookie with the Marlies last year. What are some of the challenges that goaltenders can face going from a European style coming over to North America?
Well, I think the size of the ice, number one, is you talk to goalies that have made that adjustment, and goalies that have gone the other way as well from North America to Europe. It's huge. It's a total mindset change for a goaltender just because of what you're being faced with is different. The ability is, to go east-west is a lot more on that international sized ice compared to the North American sized ice. So you don't have that, you're not moving across your crease quite as much in that North American game. In the North American game, they're more likely to just ram it down your throat, come right to the front of the net, right? Which it's an adjustment for a lot of guys coming over because they're just like, what the heck is going on? Every rush is coming right into me. So it's a bit of an adjustment for those guys, and it's not an easy one. And I know there's been a lot of Russian goalies recently that have come over and made an immediate impact, which is not what you see a lot of the time from international goaltenders. And they put in the work. They've gone and intentionally hired a North American goalie coach to kind of give them the rundown and what to expect from the North American game. And they knew going in that it was going to be a huge challenge. So that's why you see guys like Shesterkin and Vasilevsky, they're able to jump in right away from Europe and not really need that AHL stint so much to get used to the game because they've done the prep work. And I feel like Hildeby's done that as well. He kind of knew coming in what he was going to be faced with. But he has the package that can deal with that well, right? He's not a guy who's going to be really aggressive off the rush. He can kind of sit back, like I said, and just use his frame. And I think that's probably what the Leafs liked about him when they brought him in, was that he kind of fits the mold of a guy that would do well in that kind of style of game. So it's been interesting to see how he adjusted even from the start of the season to the end of it. And like I said, it's always going to be a huge adjustment for a guy coming over from Europe, just the size of the ice alone because of the types of chances that you're going to be facing.
Yeah, you mentioned that adjustment from the start of the season to the end of the season. What did you see from him in kind of some of those changes that he made or what he developed over the course of the season?
Well, a lot of goaltending is just repetition and seeing different looks over and over again. And that's why the biggest thing for me with goaltending prospects is just make sure they're playing, consistently, even if it isn't the highest level that they can possibly play, getting game reps and getting those situational awareness that you gain from playing in those kind of scenarios. It's the only way to get it, right? No one's born naturally with those, ability. Like some guys feel like they're born naturally with the ability to read plays with the way they read some of these plays. But for most guys, it takes some time. It takes a little bit of time to know when the guy has the puck on his stick in a certain spot, he's probably going to move it to the point or he's going to move it across, just having that sort of innate memory just built up that that this is how the play is going to work out. He started to pick up some tendencies like that from the start of the season to the end of the season, just from the 1 year. So it's a really good sign. It shows that he's a quick learner. He's a guy that's able to do it at an extremely high level in the AHL. It's, for a goaltender, that's the next best level you can get to. So, I was really just intrigued by him because I didn't expect a whole lot right off the bat from Hildeby, but he certainly caught my eye the more the season wore on, just like I said, from his play reading ability and just being able to set himself up with his body and his size to just not have to make a huge movement, which is a huge thing for me, right? It's just, if you're not forcing yourself to make a lunging move, then you're setting yourself better for the second opportunity or the third opportunity. So that's what brings that calmness to the game that people like to talk about with goaltenders. They make a save and then they're already set and ready for that next one, right? And that's something that I noticed from him just as the season wore on.
What was your impression of Hildeby last summer coming off of that season with Färjestad, and how was your opinion of him maybe changed over the course of this season with his first year with the Marlies?
A lot of the flaws are still there. Like he's worked on it, obviously. And like I said, the situational awareness stuff has come a long way, but his skating, anytime a bigger goalie has that size of a frame to move around, it's tough. Skating is going to always be a struggle for a lot of those guys. They need to simplify and do things that way. So he still needs to work on his footwork a little bit like that. And having an ability to play a little more aggressively off the rush isn't a bad thing either. So if he can work that into his toolbox, that would be nice as well. So coming over from Europe, I wanted to see, hopefully some development in those areas. And like I said, it's been a little bit slower in that regard because there was the whole adjustment to just the game itself that he had to work on as well. I don't envy the position that a lot of these goalies come in when they move from Europe to North America. But like I said, he has that framework that I knew could possibly transfer well. And that's kind of what caught my eye when he was in Sweden. But it's so tough to judge. Like, it's like my worst nightmare is, scouting a lot of time is goalies out of like the Russian leagues, right? Because it's so tough to just say, how is this guy going to fare when he's put in the net with a totally different caliber of player, totally different style of player. Like as a goalie scout, it's a nightmare, right? You're really just judging these guys based off raw ability and what red flags that you see in their game potentially. and the stuff that they do really well. So for me, there weren't a ton of red flags in Hildeby's game. He was a prime candidate to come over and just throw him on your AHL team, see what he's got. And I think the Leafs may have found something with that.
Yeah, we talk about the size a lot, obviously, and that's the thing that a lot of people see first and go, "Oh, this guy could be something special." And
Yeah,
6'7", 222 pounds. Like if he stepped in the NHL tomorrow, he'd be like second tallest and like among the heaviest. Like he's a big guy. But what are some of the challenges that being that big of a goaltender also presents? Because we obviously look at size a lot as a positive. Filling more than it is obviously going to be better. But what are some of the challenges with being a bigger goaltender like that?
Yeah, with in goal, actually, we've talked for a few years. Just from talking with different goalie coaches and stuff and scouts, that there's actually sort of an ideal size range you want your goalie, and there's almost a too big. You get to a point where it becomes hard to move and hard to keep everything sealed effectively when your limbs are that long and you're opening up that many holes. As the game speeds up around you, just because you're big doesn't mean you're going to fill the entire net, right? Everyone just assumes, but it's a real struggle for those bigger 6'6", 6'7" goaltenders. Ideally now they're saying between 6'2" to 6'4" is kind of where you want to be. So 6'7" is absolutely on the larger side of that scale, and you are blessed with a lot of ability to you can be off on your on your movements a little bit because you take up so much more space. So there is still an advantage to being that big. But like I said earlier, the skating is always a tough one for bigger goaltenders because just of the sheer amount of weight and size you got to haul around the crease. It's not easy for a lot of guys. And then your the tendency to open up a lot of bigger goaltenders, if they're moving and they reach for a puck, that area underneath their arm is twice as large as a goaltender who's 6 feet, like a UC Saros coming across. It's a lot easier for him to stay compact and move across. For those bigger goaltenders, they really have to work on it. And the guy that I point to all the time is Jacob Markstrom. And he struggled with that big time earlier in his career, opening up holes, reaching for pucks. When you're a big goalie, those are giant, spotlight targets for those shooters to shoot at. And it can be really challenging for goaltenders that are bigger to simplify their game, reel it back a little bit, and stay compact. So when you do have to make a big movement, you're not opening up a giant hole under your arm, or you're not, just lunging for pucks. You're actually in good position. So with Hildeby, I think that's obviously something he's had to work on, and it's something he actually does pretty well. I think for a 6'7" guy, I give him a lot of credit. He doesn't open up a ton, and maybe errs on the side of caution a little too much in his game right now, where you can tell he's a little afraid to make that aggressive move because he doesn't want to open up, and that costs him sometimes. But like I said, as he gains more experience and more time in North America, that's only going to get better.
Yeah, we look at some of the biggest goalies in the NHL right now. You mentioned Freddie Anderson. He's consistently been one of the heaviest goaltenders the entire time he's been in the NHL. You look at the starters listed at 6'6" or above on NHL.com. You have guys like Jacob Markstrom, like you mentioned. Jake Ottinger's listed at 6'6". Anthony Stolarz, who the Leafs recently signed as well, listed at 6'6". What are some of the attributes that make those guys effective at the NHL, given their kind of significant size over, like you mentioned, that ideal kind of 6'3", 6'4" range where you have the best of both worlds of being that big goaltender, but also not opening up those lanes like you mentioned?
Yeah, well, it's like I said, using that size to your advantage, right? So those guys, they may not have the advantage of being an aggressive goaltender that's going to surprise you and jump out at you, but what they do well is they just take up a lot of space in the net, and a lot of those goalies that you listed are super, super effective on their posts. So a lot of the game these days is played below the goal line and behind the net, low to high passing plays. A guy like Markstrom again comes to mind, where he's so comfortable on his posts when the puck is worked from post to post, and Hildeby is very similar in that regard, where a lot of times he's big enough where he can put each foot one on each post and just sort of crouch down and wait for that puck. And that's such an advantage to be able to have that flexibility, and B, have just the leg size to be able to reach from post to post like that. Not everyone can do that, and that's an advantage that they have. And just when he does seal on his post, he's consistent in hitting his spots. He's very good at just sealing the post, making sure there's no space along there for the trickle in goals that you see a lot with the bigger goaltenders, where they're just so large You think of it like a 6'7" person looking at their toes. Like it's a long way down there, right? So in order to seal all the spots, you really need to be on your point and effective on your posts. And he's got that. Like you don't see the trickle in goals too often, or enough that it worries me, because it is going to happen to every goaltender. You're not going to be perfect. So that's the big thing I look for with the bigger goaltenders. Is just yes, they may not be as effective off the rush because they don't have that backwards flow. But man, if they're good on their posts and they're able to get to those low, high passing plays with a good transition off their posts, then they've got it made because they got the size. They don't need to take as much space because they don't need to come out as far. When you have good post play and that combined, you become a really tough goaltender to beat from a low to high passing play. But the other thing with bigger goaltenders too is just the ability to stay healthy is the thing I worry about too, because that's a lot of weight going up and down on your hips and your rotations. The big thing is for bigger goaltenders now is load management, right? Like actually not playing as much because it's just the sheer weight of playing the position at that size. A guy like Robin Lehner comes to mind. Like it wears your body out. So that would be the only other thing I'd worry about with Hildeby is just load management. Make sure he's taking his rest days when he needs to. Because at that size, you do a lot of damage to your hips, and it can be surgery time later in his career if he's not careful.
Yeah, I was actually just about to ask about the durability concerns or with bigger goaltenders. Actually, Hildeby a couple years ago, before his big breakout season in the Swedish junior circuit, had elective double hip surgery, and then he had his big season in junior. Was drafted by the Maple Leafs, goes to the SHL, has a good season, and then comes over here to the North American ranks in the AHL. Is that something that is a red flag at all to undergo that procedure at that young of an age, or is that just something that is kind of not necessarily normal, but something that is more just kind of in the past for a goaltender like Hildeby?
It's the sign of the times, is what it is. Honestly, I've talked to the doctors that do a lot of these surgeries. I talked to the doctor that did Thatcher Demko's surgery, and they can do the preemptive surgery, so you can be screened to see. It has to do with the way your hip bone and the socket come together. And if your hip bone is shaped a certain way, you're more at risk to wearing out that cartilage that's the lubricant between your hip and the bone. So they can go in there and do what they did with Hildeby and just sort of smooth everything out, so that when potentially any issues that could arise, you avoid some of those. But as I was told by some of these doctors, you can do the preemptive surgery. That doesn't guarantee you're never going to get surgery down the road. So, a lot of goalies do get it done. I don't see it as a red flag personally. One of the goalies in the draft this year that went super high, Emil Vinny, the Oilers pick, he's had the surgery as well. So clearly NHL teams aren't that worried about it. And like I said, if you're not getting it at a young age preemptively, then you'll just be getting it likely later on in your career at some point. And I think the number is close to about 70% of NHL goaltenders. So it's not something you can avoid. It's like Tommy John surgery for pitchers in baseball. It's not really something you can avoid these days. But I think we're learning more as time goes on about load management and just practices in general, how they treat goaltenders at the NHL level. The teams are becoming more aware of it. So I'm hoping in the future we don't see as many hip problems. But it's simply unavoidable for a lot of goaltenders, especially at that size.
Yeah, and for a goaltender of this size in Hildeby, what do you think is the ideal games played range? We saw him play 41 games last year in the AHL, which I believe is the most he's ever played. You look back a couple years ago in the SHL, he played in kind of that 28, 29 game range, a bit more when you include some of the Champions League hockey and things like that as kind of a 1A, 1B situation there in the SHL. What do you see as kind of an ideal range for a massive goaltender like this to, like you said, load manage?
Yeah, the games you definitely want to keep an eye on. I think at least as long as he's getting at least 40 games, I think is the bar that you want to set. I wouldn't go much higher than 60, but that's tricky when you get into playoffs at international hockey if he's playing for Sweden somewhere. Yeah, you never know really where to ballpark it, but I think a lot of the time actually the practice is when they really have to be careful. And I know in the NHL level, they're actually really the Players Association is pushing hard for a third goalie spot, like a rostered goalie spot on NHL teams, simply for practices where you have a veteran guy that can step in, give your starter the full day off. He doesn't even need to dress to go to practice. I think that kind of stuff will do more for preserving the health of your hip than a game situation, because in practice you're getting 200, 300 shots rather than 40 shots maybe in your game, right? So it's to me the practice management is key, and that's just hoping your organization has good goaltending coaching and goalie coaches that have voices in the organization that can push for these kinds of things. A lot of organizations don't, so their goalies wear out. But I think the Leafs are pretty well set with the situation they've got, and I think they are monitoring it closely. So they're one of the good organizations, at least now, when it comes to that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think as long as for me, for getting that situational awareness and soaking up enough games, as long as he's getting in the 40 plus range, I would say that's where you want him to be.
Yeah, and the Leafs have, like you mentioned, quite a few goaltenders actually in kind of the organization working on things like that. The goaltender coach is Curtis Sanford from out in Vancouver for a while there. Hannu Toivonen at the AHL level, and then also Curtis McElhaney running kind of the overall department, kind of higher up in the front office as well. So the Leafs definitely have a lot of those goaltenders there that have played a while from a bunch of different backgrounds as well to definitely oversee things from a management perspective and also a development perspective as well. Mm-hmm. And so looking at that development perspective, we've seen Hildeby go from an SHL kind of 1B, 1A situation to basically the clear-cut Marley starter over the entire season, playing 40 plus games and being the starter in the playoffs. What do you see as his NHL upside? Can he be an NHL starter?
I think he can. I think he's, like I said, still has some work to do, smoothing out some of the finer details of his game. But his biggest issue right now in the Leafs organization, they can't believe I'm saying this right now, is that he might be blocked. As
crazy.
From all the conversations I've had about Leafs goaltending in the last decade, now he gets here and he has a big situation in front of him with Joseph Woll with the new contract and Anthony Stolarz, who's a guy I've been just hoping would get a starting job somewhere for so long. And to see him land in Toronto is just, it's almost bizarre in a way that the Leafs are just now, in my mind, just loaded with goaltenders. And then there's still the Matt Murray wild card that you throw in there, right? So I think the Leafs have done an excellent job in quickly turning around what was a very turbulent goalie corps, we'll say, over the last little while with Campbell and Anderson.
That's definitely fair to
say. So I like I said a second ago, the Joseph Woll, I think he's going to be a starter for a very long time in the National Hockey League. So Hildeby's biggest challenge might be just finding an organization that he can step into quickly, because it might not be the Leafs. If there's injuries, then obviously there's going to be a chance for him to step in there. But to get a real opportunity, he might have to go to a different organization, which isn't a bad thing for the Leafs either. Having a surplus of goaltending is a good thing. That's a strong point of your organization, and you can just flip them for another draft pick or a prospect later on, which I don't see as a bad thing either. So I've seen it in Vancouver for a number of years where they just have a pipeline of guys coming through all the time, and it's not a bad thing. It's a great problem to have, and it's a sign that your goaltending development is working the way it should. So if they do lose a guy like Hildeby eventually in a couple of years, it might be bittersweet, but like I said, it's a sign that things are working and they're targeting the right guys to come over from North America.
Yeah, and just finally wrapping up here, you talk about kind of maybe being blocked for a couple of years. What do you see as Hildeby's kind of timeline to make the NHL? He's going to be 23 by the start of this season. He's maybe a little bit older than people think, just because he was drafted as like a double or triple overager out of Sweden. Mm-hmm. So he's got a bit of an accelerated timeline here, despite being a 1-year AHLer right now. We talk about the Woll extension, but I think mm-hmm. the bigger factor for Hildeby making the Leafs or becoming a Toronto Maple Leaf is the Stolarz contract, where he's a 2-year deal. Do you think it's something where Hildeby plays the next couple of years in the AHL and they hope to take that backup role by the time that Stolarz' contract is up? Or what do you think is the ideal situation there if he's to remain with the Maple Leafs?
Yeah, it's hard to say what their plan is for him. Obviously, they like him and they want to work him mm-hmm. in. So I could see a scenario like that working out. But I'm pretty bullish on most prospects, that especially ones that are playing at a high level in the AHL. I think it's the old trope that goalies take a really long time to develop. I think that's a product of the fact that there's only 2 goalie spots on every organization.
There's not a lot of goalies that get to play.
And GMs are just programmed to baby their goalies along, which I don't think is necessary these days. I think there's a ton of goalies that are 22, 23 out there that could easily be making an impact in the NHL, but there's an NHL goalie with a 5-year contract that needs to play. And, there's just so many scenarios. There's no fourth line for these guys to sit on and still get games like a forward can, right? So I think that he's certainly closer than a lot of people probably think. The Leafs obviously think he's pretty close, but like I said, he probably needs at least another year of a full AHL schedule, I think, before I'm confident in throwing him into games and seeing what he's got. But if the situation comes where he needs to come up for a few games, I think he's absolutely see what he's got, throw him in there. And the only way he's going to learn and know that the type of level he needs to get to is by seeing that kind of action on a regular basis. So, like I said, I'm more bullish than most people when it comes to goalie prospects, but maybe that's just because of the business I'm in.
Definitely. But no, I mean, over the past, like 10, 15 years, we've seen every position trend younger. And I think the next one, obviously, to do that is goaltending, and it's only a matter of time. So, Greg, thanks for jumping on today. Let the people know where they can find your work and where to follow you.
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, at Greg Balloch, Balloch. I post most of my articles and things there. They go up on EP Rinkside. I do all the goalie blurbs for their prospect guides, and if you search a goalie on EP Prospects, if it's from the last 2 years, then you'll see my little blurb in the bio there for the guys. So you can go there and check it out. And like I said, yeah, check me out on social media. I pop out on In Goal magazine every once in a while. And if you're in Vancouver, I'm on the radio out here on Sportsnet 650. But I don't know how many Leafs fan listeners will be out in the Vancouver. Maybe you have a couple, but
maybe a couple. You never know.
Check me out if you're out on the West Coast.
Definitely. And I can absolutely say the EP Rinkside prospect rankings and the blurbs and stuff are always must read for myself getting ready for every single season. So I can't recommend checking those out enough. Greg, thanks for taking the time in the summer here to chat a little bit about a fourth string Maple Leafs goaltender.
Appreciate you having me on. Thanks.
Another big thanks to Greg for jumping on. That was a great conversation about the Leafs' top goaltending prospect and what we could potentially see from him in the next couple of years. That's going to do it for the first week of Leafs Camp Countdown. If you missed any of the previous episodes this week, be sure to check those out. Started things off with Ben Danford and also had Nick Matanen, Philippe Myers, and Matt Leahy this week, finishing things off with a little goalie action. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube if you prefer to watch the show, as well as check out the show on podcasting platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks for tuning in this week, and we'll be back on Monday for more Maple Leafs Camp Countdown. We'll see you then.